Hello and welcome to How Green Is Your Deal, a podcast about Europe's path to climate neutrality, the challenges it faces, and the ideas that guide it. I'm your host Jana Jöns, a climate policy researcher at Stockholm University, and this podcast is part of the GreenDeal-NET network and the EU Climatic Project. Welcome to the new season of How Green Is Your Deal. Last year we took a closer look at the EU's external climate action, and we explored things like what it means to be a climate leader and the instruments the EU uses to have an impact abroad. This season we turn a bit more inward and we examine the relationship between, on the one hand, the climate transition and on the other hand, the question of strengthening democracy at times of democratic backsliding. So we explored this question of, can democracies actually deliver the scale and the speed that is needed to address the climate crisis? And what are some of the tools we can use to both strengthen democracy and encourage more climate action? I'm not doing this by myself, but for this season I'm working together with the RETOOL project. This is a project that looks at precisely this question of democratic strengthening and addressing climate action. And as you will see, many of the guests this season work for the RETOOL project and they will present the findings of their research there. We start with our guest today, Diarmuid Torney, who is a professor at Dublin City University, where he is also the director of the Institute for Climate and Society, and he's also the coordinator of the RETOOL project. Hi Diarmuid, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me, Jana.
I think it's great to have such an expert on democracy and climate change to start off this season. And maybe to begin, can you first highlight what are some of the challenges democracies actually face in addressing the climate crisis?
Sure. Well, climate change is a really challenging policy problem for all kinds of governance systems, and democracies are certainly no exception. But there are certain characteristics of the climate challenge that arguably make it particularly difficult for countries with democratic regimes to address climate change. So on the one hand, there's the question of time and urgency. So we know that acting on climate change is urgent, but it's also long-term. So we need to take ambitious actions today, but we also need to do so over a sustained period of time. And the way that democracies are structured, with periodic elections every 3, 4, 5 years, depending on the regime, that makes it difficult for politicians to take the longer term view. You sometimes hear politicians say that they know what they need to do, but they don't know how to get elected afterwards. So there's a set of challenges around the time dimension. There's also the fact that climate change is very much a cross-sectoral challenge. It doesn't fall into one particular area of policy making. Once upon a time, if we look back 10 or 20 years, there was a view that climate change was essentially an environmental challenge, or maybe a challenge of the energy sector. We know now that addressing climate change cuts across all sorts of different policy areas, from agriculture and food to industrial systems and processes, the traditional sectors of energy and environment. So having a problem that cuts across so many different policy areas makes it difficult for governments to coordinate. Mm-hmm. Then there's the multi-level dimension. So climate action needs to be taken at the local level, at the regional and national level, and at the European and international level. So it's not isolated at any one of those levels, but needs concerted action across all of those different levels. There are also then particular characteristics around the climate action and its contestation and the degree to which it's politicized or high on the political agenda. We've seen in recent years this play out with, for example, the Gilets jaunes in France and other similar examples in a variety of different jurisdictions. So, on the one hand, that that contestation and politicization allows for climate movements to mobilize, but it also provides the space for opponents of climate action to mobilize and draw political attention as well. And then the last characteristic that I would touch on is questions around justice and injustice. There are a whole variety of justice concerns around climate action. There's spatial justice, so between different countries and within countries between different regions. There's temporal injustice and justice considerations between current and future generations. And then there are intersectional injustices, how climate action and inaction intersects with a range of other concerns and characteristics, race, gender, and so forth. So all of those together paint a picture of a very challenging context for climate action.
So from your answer, I mean, I think we all know this, but the climate crisis or climate change is so complex. As you said, like it cuts across policy cycles, it cuts across sectors, it cuts across levels of governance from the very local to the very international. And then at the same time, because it also so visible, or it actually doing the climate transition can be so intrusive in people's lives sometimes, it can also lead to a lot of politicization, or political actors can use it for their own gain as well. And there is this whole question then on top of it of how to make sure that everyone is actually included in the transition. So very complex challenge for our democracies. Then we see that sometimes there's people who argue, okay, actually to deal with this kind of complexity, we need to move away from democracies and maybe have sort of these planetary stewards or the scientists to like help us do everything. So kind of taking it away from the political sphere. I think there's also people, maybe a bit like yourself as well, who then say, but wait, what is the other direction? Do we need more democracy? Can you tell a little bit your view on how this question, or how you see this question of more or less democracy to deal with sort of this complexity?
Sure. Well, I think we need to start by acknowledging that we're not in a great place, and this is a challenging time for both climate action and democracy. So in Europe, the green wave that came in and leading up to 2019, those European Parliament elections, I think it's fair to say has gone out again. I'm certain it'll return, but that's where we are now. The whole tenor of European politics is around competitiveness and security, with an emphasis on what is sometimes euphemistically called simplification, which in my view is simple deregulation. And then on the democracy side, we're witnessing a democratic recession, so a retrenchment or backsliding of democratic practices, and increasing attractiveness of strongman politics. And I think that's driven, at least in part, by a feeling among electorates of being left out of decision making, of politics not delivering for them. So that's the challenging context in which we're operating, and in which the RETOOL project is operating. And as you said in your question, Jana, there's a now long-running debate in the scholarly literature around the compatibility or otherwise of climate action with strong democratic governance. And as you said, there's on the one hand a group of scholars and practitioners in some cases who call for some kind of green or eco-authoritarianism, or some of the labels use something like a benign dictator. There are different forms of this. Some versions of delegation of policy functions to independent agencies can be seen through this lens. I think in popular discourse, a lot of this is underpinned by what I see as a slightly romanticized view of China in particular, and the degree to which China has been able in recent years and in the last decade or two to really push forward with things like renewable energy, wind and solar, electric vehicles, and so forth. But I think that view of China misses important questions of both complexity. So you know, a lot of the same contested politics around the energy transition plays out in China. It's just that it doesn't play out in public in the way that it does in Western countries because of the nature of the Chinese regime. And then there's the question of how strong the central government in Beijing is, and the extent to which it's able really to control what's going on in the provinces, because of course China is such a vast country. So I think if we dig a little deeper, the story of China and climate action is a bit more complicated than that simplistic view would recognize. And as you said, Jana, in recent years, there's been a resurgent focus on democracy and on new practices within democracy that can enable us to develop stronger responses to the climate crisis. And I think that's driven both by normative perspectives and empirical perspectives. So normatively, it's my view that democracy is a better way of doing collective decision making than all of the alternatives, as the old saying goes. Empirically, though, it's clear from the available evidence that authoritarian regimes don't particularly perform better on environmental policy making, on climate action policy making. So if we look at the empirical evidence, actually democracies are shown to perform better in terms of environmental policies. But then added to that, we're seeing a range of new practices in democracies and democratic innovations emerging that really challenge that view, that the eco-authoritarian view, and that's really it's studying those new practices is a big part of what we're interested in doing within the RETOOL project.
Mm-hmm. And then especially, I mean, you started your answer also with highlighting this sort of democratic backsliding we're in. It also seems like implementing an eco-authoritarian regime would be quite difficult at the moment, or would also perhaps not give the changes that we want, or there would be even more of a backlash against it with all of the consequences attached to that. So I mean, my own research on like long-term policy making, of course, I also looked a bit into it, and I think I would also tend to agree that democracies in general, because of like openness to civil society and citizen protests like we saw in 2019, can then of course create more climate action. You mentioned at the end also that there are some democratic practices or innovations that can be used to actually strengthen democracy and to give citizens and other actors also more of a voice. Can you explain a little bit more what these democratic practices are and how they can improve climate decision making?
Sure. So this really gets us to the heart of the RETOOL project, and I'm working with a whole set of different colleagues across 9 different partners in 8 European countries. And so what I'm about to say by no means is all of my work. I'm summarizing and presenting the collective efforts of a wide range of excellent colleagues who are studying these different innovations and evolutions in practices across different kind of democratic institutions. So if we start off with representative institutions, so when a lot of people think about democracy, they think about national parliaments or regional parliaments. And so that's a first building block of what we're looking at within RETOOL. We're studying a range of different case studies at national level. We've looked at the role of the Parliamentary Budget Office in Austria. We've looked at digital participation platforms in Estonia, and we've looked at parliamentary accountability mechanisms in Ireland, and sought to draw lessons from all of those. And across all of our research, I think it's important to say that there isn't a silver bullet. There isn't one magical approach. but there's lessons to be learned from each of these different case studies we've conducted. Another type of institution that we're studying within RETOOL is the role of courts and climate litigation. Courts provide mechanisms for access to justice and to hold governments accountable for their climate pledges and hold government climate policies up to standards such as human rights standards. And so within RETOOL, we are looking at climate cases before the European Court of Justice. So we've done a mapping. Colleagues within the project have mapped ECJ cases with a climate dimension, and they're looking at a case study of climate litigation in Ireland, where a strategic climate litigation has played a prominent role. Moving on then to independent advisory bodies are another type of institution where we're looking at how these bodies that are tasked with feeding expert scientific advisory, expert scientific advice into the policy process are operating. And we're particularly looking at contemporary examples where such bodies are operating in a context of backsliding by governments on their climate commitments. Moving on then to institutions for deliberative participation, we're interested in the role of citizens' assemblies and similar processes. We've studied a range of case studies in Belgium, Sweden, and Ireland. Each of these different case studies has different characteristics. So the Belgian Climate Assembly is permanent in nature. The Swedish Climate Assembly was commissioned by civil society rather than government. The Irish case studies we're looking at, the Climate Assembly happened a bit longer ago, back in 2017, so we're interested in the legacy of that. And we're also looking at citizens' assemblies on the question of biodiversity loss. And then we're also interested in how citizens' assemblies, so these new democratic innovations, operate in the context of newer democracies. So countries that have transitioned to democracy more recently. So we're looking there at case studies in Estonia and Poland. And then finally, we're looking less institutionally at the role of climate movements and bottom-up mobilization. So we're looking at climate movements of the past, going back to the early days of the environmental movement in the 70s and 80s, but we're also looking at contemporary climate movements and the kinds of claims they make and the role that emotions play in the claims that they make, and in particular the context in which contemporary climate movements are operating in, which is one where there is a shrinking space for protest, a concerning shrinking space. So that kind of gives a flavour of the kinds of innovations that are happening and what we're looking at within the RETOOL project. But coming back to what I said earlier, it's important to say that there isn't one silver bullet, and it's important to have different constellations of institutions. So rather than thinking that litigation will solve it all, or an expert advisory body, we're interested in how these different institutions interact with each other.
Mm-hmm. If I understand it correctly, there's then seem to be also innovations that work both within the system that we already have in sort of strengthening the elements that we have when it comes to parliaments, but also, like you said, when it comes to the courts, making sure that they're able to do their job and citizens also have access to the courts, that they can petition something related to climate and the environment if they want. And then there's also innovations that look more towards expanding the decision-making to have more scientific expertise or to include more citizens in the decision-making through these deliberative climate assemblies and everything. And then, of course, in a democracy, ideally, there should also be space for bottom-up action, as you then mentioned, which I think, as you said, is a bit under threat also in Europe, where we see a lot of criminalization of climate activists in the recent years. Many of these innovations we'll also discuss in detail in the rest of the season. Like the next episode, for instance, will be on climate assemblies. So we'll dig a little bit deeper in that. And some of these issues we've also discussed in the past, like environmental movements and climate activism and litigation. So if you're interested, listener, make sure to look at our back catalog. All the episodes will be available there. Then, as you mentioned in the beginning, like climate change is such a complex issue that also should be addressed at different levels, like the local level, the national level, the supranational level when we're talking about the EU, but also the international level. When we're discussing these things to also strengthen democracy, do you see ways that they can also be scaled up to address also these higher levels of governance?
Yeah, I think there are opportunities, though it's important to say also that a lot of climate politics is place-based. So it's important to embed solutions to climate change in local and regional contexts. But having said that, I think there is scope to scale up, and within the RETOOL project, we also have a set of EU-level case studies. So we're looking at the role of public participation in EU climate policy making and how the role of public participation can be strengthened. And we're keen to push back there and across all of our work on the notion that public participation involving citizens in decision making is something that gets in the way of climate policy making. I think that's a narrative that has taken hold in some quarters, and so we're keen. Our research contradicts that general assumption, and so we're keen to get that message out. We're also studying the prevalence of non-legislative and delegated acts in EU policy making, and we're also interested in the policy advisory system for climate change at EU level. So through all of that work, we're very interested in questions of scaling up democratic innovations of various kinds and evolutions in our practices to the EU level. Scaling up to the global level then is a bit more challenging again, and the focus for now of the RETOOL project is primarily on the European context. So that the question of the global level isn't fully within our scope, but we are interested in reflecting on our findings from a global perspective, and we're hoping to engage with, for example, the COP process later this year to present the findings of the RETOOL project at the COP in Turkey towards the end of this year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so at the European level, just because there is a lot more decision making or initiatives there, or there also have been a lot of these public participation initiatives, it might be a bit easier. On the international level, in our previous episode with Karen Beckstrand, we also discussed a little bit the role civil society can play, and also how these COP have sort of become these arenas for like civil society discussions from all over the world. So again, for the listener, if you're interested a bit in those dynamics, then make sure to listen or watch to our previous episodes. Then maybe one question to end that I always ask our listeners. So I feel like at every episode we are in perhaps more trying times with a lot of turbulence and crisis going on. And as you mentioned, also this democratic backsliding that we see with the rise of this authoritarian populism. In all this sort of challenging context, is there something that gives you hope for the future still?
Sure. So I think it's important that we do acknowledge the challenging context in which we're operating, and I find it challenging to work in this space at the moment. But one thing that certainly gives me hope is an experience I had a number of years ago now designing and running a children and young people's assembly on biodiversity loss. So this actually is a case study that we're studying within the RETOOL project, but I was personally involved. We were tasked, I and some colleagues in Dublin City University and also in University College Cork in Ireland, with designing and running basically a citizens' assembly for children. And so it took place over 2 weekends in October 2022, so a few years ago at this stage. It brought together 35 children and young people from across Ireland, chosen through a democratic lottery process. But we also worked very closely over the months preceding it with a young advisory team of 9 members aged 8 to 16, and they played a crucial role in helping us to design a process that was fun and engaging for children. And what I learned from the whole process was the power of the voice of children and young people and their creativity and their ideas. And I think that's best captured in one of the key messages that came out of the assembly, which is that we must treat the earth like a member of the family or a close friend, which I think is just a beautiful way of capturing that idea of stewardship of the earth. But the story didn't end in October 2022. The legacy has continued right up to the present, in fact. The responsible minister, then Minister Malcolm Noonan, came to the final weekend of the assembly and also came back a year later to meet the children and young people at their 1-year reunion to report back on what he and the Irish government had done to follow up on their recommendations. Representatives from the Assembly met with a committee of the National Parliament in Ireland, and some of their recommendations were reflected in national biodiversity policy in Ireland. So it's a process that really had a significant impact on policymaking, but also on the lives of the children who take part. We continue to hear from them, and indeed they continue to be ambassadors for the Assembly. So over the last year, participants in the Assembly have spoken at events in Dublin, in Brussels, and even in Geneva at the United Nations Forum on Human Rights and Democracy. So it's really a story that continues to unfold. And so that's when I'm feeling a bit gloomy about the state of the world, about climate action, and the challenges that we see to democracy. I think back to that experience, which really opened my eyes to the power of the voice of children and young people.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that example. I think that also really clearly shows the value that these democratic innovations can have, right? Like both for the participants and how they can sort of make them advocates for climate action, but also if policymaking institutions are recipients or are open to dealing with some of the findings, that it can also have this lasting change that spans across just this one innovation that happened. Thank you so much for sharing all your insights with us today, Diarmuid. It was really nice to have you on.
Thanks for having me on, Jana.
That's it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to How Green Is Your Deal on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening. If you want to stay informed on GreenDeal-NET's activities, please go to greendeal-net.eu and subscribe to the newsletter.